February 3rd, 1965, 11:47 p.m. The snow crunched beneath Malcolm X's polished Oxford shoes as he climbed the weathered brownstone steps on West 147th Street. Each footfall echoed through the hushed Harlem night like a countdown to destiny. In his right hand he gripped a leather briefcase, genuine cowhide, the kind they made in Detroit before the assembly lines took over everything, that contained documents so explosive they could reshape American history. 3 weeks and 18 days later, Malcolm would be gunned down at the Audubon Ballroom in a hail of bullets that would silence one of the most powerful voices in America. But on this bitter February night, with frost forming on storefront windows and steam rising from manholes like ghosts of the city's industrial heart, the most influential black leader in the nation had come to see Harlem's undisputed king with a message so dangerous that both men understood speaking it aloud was tantamount to signing their own death warrants. The brownstone at 409 West 147th Street stood like a fortress of respectability amid the controlled chaos of Upper Manhattan's most famous neighborhood. Built in 1923 during the Harlem Renaissance, when jazz flowed like bootleg whiskey and black intellectuals debated revolution in basement speakeasies, the building had witnessed 4 decades of triumph and tragedy. Now it served as the private residence of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a man whose reputation commanded respect from Wall Street to 145th Street, from the boardrooms of legitimate businesses to the back-alley clandestine operations that kept Harlem's underground economy humming like a well-oiled V8 engine. What Malcolm X planned to share with Bumpy Johnson, in those final precious minutes of privacy, would remain locked in secrecy for decades. Buried deeper than Jimmy Hoffa, more classified than the Manhattan Project documents. But the 7 words he would whisper, words chosen with the precision of a master wordsmith and the urgency of a condemned man's last confession, would change everything. Not just for Harlem's tree-lined streets where children played stickball while their mothers hung laundry from fire escapes. Not just for the broader civil rights movement that had captured America's attention and conscience, for the entire trajectory of American democracy itself. This is the untold story of that last meeting between 2 legends who understood power in ways most folks never could. The conversation that was never meant to happen, recorded by no FBI surveillance equipment, witnessed by no federal informants, documented in no official reports. The warning that arrived like a telegram from hell, 3 weeks too late to save the messenger. And the 7 words that revealed a conspiracy so vast and sophisticated it would make the Kennedy assassination look like a simple mob hit. To truly comprehend what drove Malcolm X through the frigid Harlem streets on that February night, you need to understand that the man walking up those brownstone steps wasn't the same firebrand who'd spent 12 years preaching Elijah Muhammad's doctrine of black separation to packed audiences at Muhammad's Mosque No. 7. This wasn't the Malcolm X who declared white people devils, who'd proclaimed integration impossible, who'd argued that black Americans needed their own separate nation carved from American soil. The Malcolm X who knocked on Bumpy Johnson's door in the early minutes of February 4th, 1965, was a transformed man, and transformation, as any wise person over 50 understands, is the most dangerous thing that can happen to someone with power and influence. Malcolm had completed his pilgrimage to Mecca just 8 months earlier, in April 1964. He'd walked around the Kaaba with Muslims of every conceivable ethnicity. Arabs, Africans, Europeans, Asians, all united in prayer and purpose. He'd seen blue-eyed believers from Sweden praying shoulder to shoulder with dark-skinned brothers from Somalia. He'd witnessed what true religious brotherhood looked like when stripped of American racial prejudices and the artificial divisions that kept working people fighting each other instead of fighting the systems that oppressed them all. That pilgrimage had shattered Malcolm's worldview, like a baseball through a plate glass window. He'd returned to America with a radical new vision of racial cooperation that terrified both the black Muslims who'd followed him without question for over a decade, and the white establishment that had spent countless resources and sleepless nights trying to neutralize his influence. Malcolm's new message of potential racial harmony, his calls for human rights rather than just civil rights, his growing connections with African liberation movements and Third World anti-colonial struggles. All of this made him a threat to everyone who benefited from the status quo. But Malcolm's philosophical transformation had created enemies in places he'd never expected. The Nation of Islam, which had been his spiritual home and political platform for 12 transformative years, now viewed him as a dangerous apostate, whose new teachings contradicted everything Elijah Muhammad had built. They wanted him dead, not just for leaving the organization, but for exposing the moral contradictions and financial irregularities that kept the nation's leadership living in luxury, while ordinary members donated their paychecks to support the cause. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, which had been monitoring Malcolm's every move since 1953, recording his phone calls, intercepting his mail, infiltrating his organizations, documenting his speeches, photographing his associates, now classified him as a clear and present danger to national security. Edgar Hoover's files on Malcolm X were thicker than the Manhattan phone book, filled with reports from informants, surveillance photographs, psychological profiles, and contingency plans for neutralizing his influence through any means necessary. Most dangerously powerful forces within the civil rights establishment itself had begun viewing Malcolm as a liability whose new message of racial cooperation and international solidarity threatened the carefully choreographed narrative of gradual, peaceful progress that kept white America comfortable with the pace of social change. These weren't racist opponents of civil rights. These were people who'd positioned themselves as leaders of Black America while ensuring that Black liberation never moved fast enough or went deep enough to threaten the fundamental power structures that kept them in positions of controlled influence. Malcolm knew he was being watched with the intensity of a laboratory specimen. He knew his phones were tapped with technology that would make modern surveillance look primitive. He knew that every speech he delivered, every meeting he attended, every conversation he had with anyone significant was being documented by federal agents who'd been tracking his movements and associations since the early days of the Eisenhower administration. What Malcolm didn't know, what kept him awake nights, staring at the ceiling of his modest home in Queens while his wife Betty and their daughters slept peacefully, was who would make the final move to eliminate him. Would it be the Black Muslims who'd branded him a traitor to the race and to Allah himself? Would it be FBI agents operating under direct orders from Hoover, who'd publicly declared Malcolm one of the most dangerous men in America? Or would it be someone else entirely, someone with motivations that ran deeper than religious ideology or law enforcement paranoia, someone whose reasons for eliminating Malcolm X were connected to forces and interests that most Americans didn't even know existed? That uncertainty, that knowledge that death could come from any direction and in any form, was what brought Malcolm to Bumpy Johnson on the night of February 3, 1965. Not for physical protection, though Bumpy commanded an army of loyal soldiers who could have surrounded Malcolm with enough firepower to stop a small invasion. Not for financial support, though Bumpy's various legitimate and illegitimate enterprises generated more cash flow than most Fortune 500 companies. Malcolm came to Bumpy because after 12 years of public speeches covered by every major newspaper, published interviews broadcast on radio and television, and carefully documented conversations recorded for posterity, Malcolm needed to share a truth so dangerous that it couldn't be written down, couldn't be recorded on tape, couldn't be shared with anyone who might accidentally or intentionally repeat it to the wrong people. Malcolm needed to confess what he'd discovered to someone who understood how real power operated, someone who'd built and maintained an empire by keeping secrets for 4 decades, someone who would take this particular secret to his grave rather than allow it to destroy everything. Both men had spent their lives building in the community they both loved more than their own safety. Bumpy Johnson was 59 years old in February 1965. Still the undisputed emperor of Harlem's parallel economy, but increasingly focused on legitimate business investments and community development projects, rather than the numbers running, loan sharking, and muscle work that had built his financial empire during the Great Depression and World War II. Bumpy had been watching Malcolm's philosophical evolution with the fascination and concern of someone who understood how dangerous transformation could be for public figures. He recognized that Malcolm's movement toward racial cooperation and international solidarity could either bring lasting peace and prosperity to Harlem or trigger the kind of violent backlash that would destroy everything the neighborhood had accomplished during the civil rights era. The two men had never been close personal friends. Their worlds overlapped but operated according to different rules and codes, but they'd maintained mutual respect for decades, the kind of professional courtesy that existed between powerful men who understood each other's strengths and limitations. Malcolm respected Bumpy's street intelligence and his genuine commitment to Harlem's black community, even when that commitment was expressed through activities that existed outside legal boundaries. Bumpy respected Malcolm's intellectual courage and his willingness to speak uncomfortable truths that other leaders avoided, even when those truths made Malcolm a walking target for anyone with sufficient motivation and firepower. So when Malcolm's secretary called Bumpy's private line on February 2nd, a number known to fewer than 20 people in all of New York City, and requested a confidential meeting, Bumpy agreed without hesitation. He understood instinctively that Malcolm wouldn't reach out unless the situation had become urgent and potentially catastrophic for both of them. In Bumpy's world, where loyalty was currency and secrets were weapons, you didn't ignore a call for help from someone whose reputation commanded respect across racial and ideological lines. The meeting arrangements were orchestrated with the precision of a military operation and the discretion of a confession booth. Malcolm would arrive alone, no bodyguards, no assistants, no associates, who could later testify about what was discussed behind closed doors. He would approach the house after midnight, when honest folks were asleep and the kind of people who made their living in darkness would be busy with their own affairs. The timing wasn't accidental. Bumpy had learned during his 40-year career that the hours between midnight and dawn offered the best protection against surveillance, when even the most dedicated federal agents preferred the warmth of their automobiles to standing on frozen street corners with cameras and listening devices. Malcolm would stay for exactly 30 minutes, long enough to convey whatever message had prompted this unprecedented request for a private audience, but brief enough that anyone watching would assume this was a social call or a simple business discussion rather than the transfer of information that could topple governments and destroy lives. February 3rd, 11:47 p.m. Malcolm X approached Bumpy Johnson's front door with the measured steps of a man walking toward his own execution. He knocked twice against the heavy oak door, solid knocks that carried through the house like gunshots, waited exactly 10 seconds while counting his heartbeats, then delivered 3 more measured knocks, the precise signal Bumpy had specified during their brief, cryptic telephone conversation. The door opened immediately, as if Bumpy had been standing behind it counting the seconds. No delays, no questions, no unnecessary words that might carry to unwanted ears. Bumpy stood framed in the doorway wearing a burgundy silk robe over navy blue pajamas, his gray hair uncombed, but his eyes alert and focused despite the late hour. Behind him, the house was dark, except for a single table lamp in the living room, creating pools of shadow that would conceal their conversation from anyone attempting surveillance from the street. Everything about the scene had been calculated to provide maximum security and minimum visibility. "Brother Malcolm," Bumpy said quietly, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine respect mixed with concern for whatever crisis had brought Malcolm to his door. "Brother Johnson," Malcolm replied, his tone tight with barely controlled urgency, like a man holding back information that wanted to explode from his chest. They moved through the house in complete silence, past family photographs chronicling Bumpy's 40-year rise from Depression-era street hustler to Harlem royalty, past expensive furniture that reflected both his legitimate business success and his illegitimate financial empire, past symbols of respectability that coexisted comfortably with reminders of the violence and cunning that had made such respectability possible. The house itself told the story of a man who'd learned to navigate between worlds, legal and illegal, violent and peaceful, criminal and civic leader, without ever losing his essential identity or betraying the community that had shaped him. The living room had been prepared like a stage set, 2 leather chairs positioned facing each other at an angle that allowed quiet conversation while ensuring neither man would feel cornered or threatened. Close enough for intimate discussion, far enough apart to maintain the dignity and personal space that powerful men required when sharing dangerous secrets. A crystal decanter filled with bourbon sat on the side table between them, along with 2 glasses that caught the lamplight like amber jewels. Malcolm set his briefcase on the Persian rug beside his chair but made no move to open it immediately. The briefcase itself was a study in contradictions. expensive enough to reflect Malcolm's growing international reputation and influence, but worn enough to show that he valued substance over appearance, function over flash. Inside that leather rectangle lay documents that could rewrite American history, but for now it remained closed, its secrets locked away until the proper moment for revelation. Bumpy poured bourbon from the crystal decanter with the practiced ease of a man who'd hosted thousands of similar meetings over the decades. Offered one glass to Malcolm with a gesture that combined hospitality with understanding that his guest might be too nervous to accept alcohol given the circumstances. Malcolm declined with a small shake of his head. His hands clasped tightly together in his lap. His entire body radiated tension. Not fear exactly, but the coiled energy of someone carrying information too dangerous to hold and too important to release carelessly. "You wouldn't have called unless the situation had become critical," Bumpy said as he settled into his chair with his bourbon, his voice carrying 40 years of experience in reading dangerous men in dangerous situations. "What's weighing on your mind?" Malcolm leaned forward slightly, bringing his face into the circle of lamplight, and when he spoke his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, the volume of a man who'd learned to assume that even private conversations might be overheard by people with sophisticated listening equipment and hostile intentions. "They're planning to kill me, Brother Johnson. Not the Nation of Islam, though they'll probably get the blame. Not the FBI, though they'll probably provide assistance. Someone else entirely. Someone I trusted. Someone inside the movement, who's been working with government interests all along." Bumpy's expression remained carefully neutral, but his grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his bourbon glass. In his world, accusations of betrayal weren't made lightly, and claims of murder conspiracies required substantial evidence to be taken seriously. "You have proof of this conspiracy?" Bumpy asked, his tone suggesting he hoped Malcolm had more than suspicions and paranoia to support such serious allegations. "I have pieces of a puzzle," Malcolm said, reaching into the inner pocket of his overcoat. "Conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms where they'd been taking place. Meetings I used to be invited to automatically that suddenly happened without my knowledge. Money changing hands between people who should theoretically be on opposite sides of every important issue. And yesterday afternoon I received confirmation that my worst suspicions were correct." Malcolm withdrew a single sheet of paper from his pocket, folded so small it could disappear in a closed fist. He handed it across the space between their chairs to Bumpy, who unfolded it with the careful attention of someone examining potential evidence in a capital murder case. The document was a bank deposit slip from Chase Manhattan Bank, dated January 28, 1965. $25,000 deposited into a personal account belonging to someone whose name made Bumpy's jaw tighten with surprise, anger, and the kind of disappointment that comes from discovering betrayal in places where loyalty should be absolute. "Where did you acquire this financial record?" Bumpy asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I have a friend who works in the banking industry," Malcolm explained. "Someone who's been monitoring money flows between civil rights organizations and what he calls interested parties for several months. This particular deposit was made 3 days after my speech at Columbia University. The speech where I talked about expanding the civil rights movement beyond voting rights and desegregation to include economic justice and international cooperation with African liberation movements." Bumpy studied the deposit slip again, understanding its implications with the clarity that comes from decades of experience in reading financial documents that revealed more than their creators intended. This wasn't payment for services already rendered, compensation for work completed, or reimbursement for expenses incurred. Given the timing, the amount, and the identity of the account holder, this was advance payment for services yet to be provided. And considering the current political climate, Malcolm's growing list of enemies, and the substantial sum involved, there was only one service that justified this kind of financial arrangement. "You understand what this document suggests?" Bumpy asked, though he already knew Malcolm had reached the same conclusions that were forming in his own mind. "I understand exactly what it means," Malcolm replied, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd discovered that reality was far more complex and dangerous than he'd previously imagined. "The question is what I should do with this knowledge." That's when Malcolm X leaned even closer to Bumpy Johnson, bringing their faces within inches of each other, and spoke the 7 words that would change everything. Words so dangerous that even speaking them in the privacy of Bumpy's carefully secured living room, with no recording devices and no witnesses, both men understood they were crossing a line that could result in immediate and violent retaliation. The movement has been sold to the government. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. The kind of quiet that falls over a room when someone has spoken a truth so enormous and threatening that everyone present needs time to absorb its full implications. Bumpy stared at Malcolm, his mind processing what he'd just heard, understanding that if Malcolm was correct, then everything they'd believed about the civil rights movement, everything they'd assumed about who was fighting for black freedom and who was working to prevent it, was fundamentally and catastrophically wrong. "How long have you suspected this?" Bumpy finally asked, his voice hoarse with the effort of maintaining composure while contemplating the magnitude of what Malcolm had just revealed. "I've had suspicions for several months," Malcolm said, settling back in his chair, as if speaking those 7 words had released some terrible pressure that had been building inside him. "But I knew for certain yesterday when I saw this deposit slip and others like it. Brother Johnson, this conspiracy is much larger than just money changing hands between individuals. They're not simply paying people to inform on movement activities or to report on strategic planning. They're paying people to control and direct the movement itself, to make sure it stays focused on voting rights and desegregation while never addressing economic issues or international connections that could threaten American business interests overseas." Malcolm reached into his briefcase and withdrew another document, this one typewritten on official letterhead, with the distinctive formatting that indicated government or corporate origins. "This is a memorandum from the Ford Foundation to the NAACP leadership discussing funding for voter registration drives throughout the South. But examine the conditions and restrictions they've attached to this financial support." Bumpy accepted the document and read through it carefully, his expression growing darker with each paragraph as he absorbed the full scope of what was being proposed. The memorandum outlined specific limitations on how Ford Foundation money could be utilized, specific topics that couldn't be addressed in foundation-funded activities, specific international relationships that had to be avoided by organizations receiving foundation support, and specific economic issues that were explicitly off-limits for any group that wanted to maintain their funding eligibility. "They're purchasing the movement," Bumpy said quietly, his voice reflecting the kind of amazement that comes from witnessing a conspiracy so audacious that it seems impossible even when the evidence is undeniable. "Not destroying it through opposition or violence, actually buying it and controlling it through financial manipulation. And anyone who refuses to be controlled," Malcolm said, allowing the sentence to hang unfinished in the air between them, "gets eliminated." Bumpy completed the thought, understanding now why Malcolm had risked this midnight meeting to share information that could get both of them killed. Malcolm nodded grimly. "Dr. King doesn't understand what's happening. Neither do most of the other prominent leaders. They believe the foundation money represents genuine support from white allies who want to help advance civil rights. They don't realize they're being systematically guided toward exactly the kind of limited, non-threatening reform that keeps the fundamental power structure completely intact while creating an illusion of meaningful progress." "But you figured out the real agenda," Bumpy observed. "I figured it out because I made the mistake of talking about economic justice and international solidarity," Malcolm explained, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked Harlem's quiet streets. "Because I started suggesting publicly that voting rights and desegregation weren't sufficient if black people remained economically powerless within a system designed to exploit their labor. Because I began connecting the American civil rights struggle to liberation movements in Africa and Asia, pointing out that racism in America was part of a global system of economic exploitation that benefited the same corporate interests whether they were operating in Mississippi or the Belgian Congo." Malcolm turned back toward Bumpy, his face a mixture of anger and resignation. "The moment I started talking about economics instead of just civil rights, about connecting our domestic struggle to anti-colonial movements worldwide, about challenging American capitalism rather than simply asking for inclusion in American democracy, that's when the foundation money stopped flowing to my organizations. That's when former allies started finding excuses to avoid association with my work. That's when I became expendable to people who'd previously supported my efforts. Who else knows about this conspiracy? Bumpy asked. Nobody I can trust completely, Malcolm admitted, returning to his chair. That's why I came to you tonight. You understand how real power operates in this country. You understand how control systems function. You understand that sometimes the people offering help and support are actually the most dangerous enemies, because they can destroy you from the inside while appearing to be your allies. Bumpy finished his bourbon in one deliberate swallow, set the empty glass down with the finality of a judge's gavel. 40 years of navigating treacherous political and criminal waters had taught him to recognize when a situation had moved beyond individual survival into the realm of historical consequence. What do you want from me, Brother Malcolm? Malcolm's response came without hesitation, as if he'd rehearsed these words during sleepless nights in Queens, staring at the ceiling while his family slept peacefully, unaware that their husband and father was carrying secrets that could reshape American democracy or get them all killed. I want you to remember what I've told you tonight. Every detail, every document, every connection I've described. And if something happens to me, when something happens to me, because we both know it's inevitable now, I want you to make sure Harlem understands the truth, not immediately, because that would be too dangerous for you and for anyone else brave enough or foolish enough to speak publicly about this conspiracy. But someday, when the timing is right, when people are prepared to hear uncomfortable truths about their heroes and their movements, I want you to tell them that Malcolm X didn't die because he was a black radical who threatened white America. Malcolm stood again, pacing the small space between his chair and the window, like a caged lion who'd glimpsed freedom only to realize the cage was larger and more sophisticated than he'd originally understood. I want them to know I died, because I discovered that the civil rights movement had been purchased and controlled by the same white establishment that was supposedly opposing it, that the most effective way to control your enemies isn't to fight them directly, it's to fund their organizations, shape their strategies, and eliminate anyone who refuses to follow the script you've written for them. Malcolm retrieved his briefcase, but instead of preparing to leave, he opened it and spread additional documents across Bumpy's coffee table like a poker player, revealing a winning hand that had cost him everything to obtain. There's more, Brother Johnson. Much more than financial manipulation of civil rights organizations. The documents told a story that would have seemed like paranoid fantasy if it weren't supported by bank records, foundation memos, and government correspondence that bore official seals and signatures. A systematic campaign to identify, infiltrate, and control every significant black organization in America, not through crude intimidation or obvious suppression, but through sophisticated strategies that made targets grateful for their own manipulation. They're going to blame the Nation of Islam for my assassination, Malcolm continued, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who'd seen his own death certificate already filled out in duplicate. They're going to present it as factional violence between black Muslims, tragic but inevitable given the extremist natures of both my new organization and Elijah Muhammad's movement. The media coverage will emphasize black-on-black violence, portraying my death as proof that radical black movements are inherently self-destructive. But the actual shooters won't be acting on religious motivations, Bumpy asked. The shooters might genuinely be Nation members, Malcolm acknowledged. But they'll be Nation members who've been carefully manipulated, fed selective information designed to convince them that killing me serves their religious and political interests. The real architects of my assassination will be people who understand that eliminating me eliminates the biggest single threat to their controlled opposition strategy. Malcolm walked back to the window, looking out at Harlem's empty streets where streetlights created circles of illumination in an ocean of darkness. You know what the most diabolical aspect of this whole conspiracy is, Brother Johnson? They're not trying to stop the civil rights movement. They're trying to perfect it, to create a version of black liberation that achieves just enough progress to prevent revolutionary uprising, but never enough progress to threaten the fundamental power structures that keep white America comfortable and wealthy. He turned back toward Bumpy, his face reflecting the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from carrying psychological burdens too heavy for one person to bear alone. Integration without economic redistribution. Voting rights without wealth, equality. Civil rights without human rights. They're offering black America a carefully controlled version of freedom that looks like the real thing, but functions like a more sophisticated form of slavery. Bumpy had remained silent during Malcolm's explanation. But now he stood and joined him at the window. Two powerful men looking out at a community they'd both served in different ways. Understanding that the forces arrayed against them were more subtle and more dangerous than anything they'd faced in 4 decades of struggle. "They'll come for you eventually too," Malcolm said quietly. "Maybe not immediately after my death, because that would be too obvious. But once they've successfully eliminated the civil rights leadership that can't be bought or controlled, they'll turn their attention to independent black power structures, to people like you who've built something significant outside their oversight and approval." "I've been dealing with government pressure since the Roosevelt administration," Bumpy replied. "I'll find ways to survive." "This is different from anything you've experienced before," Malcolm insisted. "This isn't just law enforcement trying to arrest criminals or politicians trying to win elections. This is the systematic elimination of black leadership that represents genuine independence from white institutional control. They're going to use everything: criminal charges, economic pressure, social isolation, character assassination, and when necessary, physical elimination. They're going to remake Black America in their own image, ensuring that every significant black leader is either on their payroll or in their cemetery." The two men stood silently at the window for several minutes, each lost in his own thoughts about the magnitude of what Malcolm had revealed and the implications for their community's future. Outside, Harlem slept peacefully, unaware that 2 of its most influential residents were discussing a conspiracy that would determine whether Black Americans achieve genuine freedom or a more palatable version of continued subjugation. "Remember the 7 words," Malcolm said finally, as he moved toward the front door. "Remember what I've told you about the movement being sold to interests that want to control rather than destroy it. And when the time comes, when you judge that people are ready to hear this truth, make sure they understand that we saw this coming." Malcolm X stepped onto the porch and paused, looking back at Bumpy Johnson one final time. "Brother Johnson, promise me something. When they write the history of what's happening to black leadership in the 1960s, make sure someone remembers that it wasn't accidental. It wasn't the inevitable result of personality conflicts or ideological differences. It was planned, systematic, and brilliantly executed by people who understood that the most effective way to defeat a liberation movement is to take control of it." With those words, Malcolm X descended the brownstone steps and disappeared into the Harlem night, becoming one more shadow among the many that moved through Upper Manhattan streets in the early hours before dawn. 21 days later, he was dead. February 21st, 1965. The Audubon Ballroom. Malcolm X approached the podium to address an audience of 400 people who'd gathered to hear his latest thoughts on the evolution of the civil rights struggle. In the front row sat 3 men who'd been carefully selected, meticulously prepared, and strategically positioned for what was about to unfold. Their presence wasn't accidental, their motivation wasn't spontaneous, and their actions wouldn't be the result of religious fanaticism or ideological disagreement. The official investigation would focus exclusively on the Nation of Islam connection, portraying the assassination as inevitable consequence of Malcolm's defection from Elijah Muhammad's organization. 3 black men with documented ties to the nation would be arrested, tried, and convicted. Case closed, questions answered, narrative established. But Bumpy Johnson knew better. He'd seen the bank deposit slip that proved Malcolm's assassination had been financed in advance. He'd heard Malcolm's explanation of how the murder would be orchestrated and blamed on factional violence within the black Muslim community. He understood that Malcolm's death wasn't about religion, ideology, or personal vendetta. It was about eliminating someone who'd discovered how completely the civil rights movement had been compromised by the very interests it was supposedly challenging. The assassination was executed with the precision of a military operation and the misdirection of a magic trick. 3 shooters, all with genuine connections to the Nation of Islam, all with documented grievances against Malcolm, all positioned to make the shooting appear spontaneous rather than premeditated. The confusion following the gunshots prevented witnesses from observing crucial details. The investigation concentrated exclusively on the Nation of Islam angle, ignoring evidence that might suggest broader conspiracy or more sophisticated planning. Within hours of Malcolm's death, media coverage was emphasizing the black-on-black violence narrative, presenting the assassination as tragic but predictable outcome of extremist infighting that discredited both Malcolm's evolving message and the Nation of Islam simultaneously. The story that Malcolm had been killed by fellow black Muslims became accepted historical fact, despite forensic evidence suggesting the shooting had been more coordinated and more professionally executed than spontaneous religious violence could explain. But Bumpy Johnson remembered Malcolm's prophetic warning. He remembered the 7 words that had predicted exactly how the assassination would be framed and interpreted. And as subsequent years brought the systematic elimination of other black leaders who dared to speak about economic justice and international solidarity, Bumpy understood that Malcolm's murder had been just the opening move in a larger campaign. The pattern emerges, 1965 to 1970. 1965. Malcolm X assassinated 3 weeks after discussing economic justice and international solidarity with African liberation movements. 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. begins expanding his message beyond civil rights to include economic inequality in opposition to the Vietnam War. FBI surveillance of King intensifies dramatically, employing techniques previously reserved for foreign espionage cases. 1968, King assassinated. Exactly 1 day after announcing plans for a Poor People's Campaign that would have brought together civil rights organizations, labor unions, and anti-poverty groups in a sustained challenge to American economic structures. 1969. Fred Hampton, 21-year-old Black Panther leader whose community programs and international solidarity work had made him enormously popular in Chicago, assassinated by police in a raid coordinated with federal law enforcement agencies. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone paying careful attention. Black leaders who restricted their activities to voting rights and legal challenges to segregation were allowed to continue their work, though under constant surveillance and occasional harassment. Black leaders who expanded their focus to include economic redistribution, international connections, or systematic critiques of American capitalism were eliminated through character assassination, false criminal charges, or physical violence. By 1970, the civil rights movement had been successfully transformed from a grassroots liberation struggle into a foundation-funded reform effort. Money flowed generously to organizations that focused on electoral politics and legal challenges to discriminatory laws. Funding disappeared completely for organizations that advocated economic restructuring or maintained connections with anti-colonial movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Black leadership was gradually replaced by leaders who'd been vetted and approved by foundation boards dominated by white corporate interests. The new generation of civil rights leaders understood instinctively which topics were acceptable for public discussion and which issues were off-limits for organizations that wanted to maintain their funding and their legitimacy within mainstream American politics. Bumpy's final warning, 1968. 3 years after Malcolm's assassination, Bumpy Johnson was dying. Heart disease. The inevitable consequence of 40 years managing stress, violence, and the constant pressure that came with maintaining power in America's most scrutinized black community. But before death claimed him, Bumpy ensured that Malcolm's message would survive his own passing. In July 1968, Bumpy gathered his most trusted associates, men who'd worked with him through wars with Dutch Schultz, conflicts with Italian crime families, and battles against corrupt police and federal agents. Men who understood the value of secrets, and who'd proven their ability to keep dangerous information secure until the appropriate moment for revelation arrived. Malcolm X came to see me 3 weeks before they murdered him, Bumpy told them, his voice weak but his words clear and purposeful. He discovered something that explains everything that's happened to black leadership since 1965. Something that explains why the civil rights movement changed so dramatically after his assassination. Bumpy explained about the financial documents Malcolm had shown him, about the Foundation memos that revealed systematic control mechanisms, about Malcolm's realization that the movement had been purchased rather than simply opposed by hostile forces. He shared the 7 words that had predicted not just Malcolm's death, but the systematic elimination of any black leader who couldn't be bought, controlled, or neutralized through less permanent means. "They're gonna come for me too," Bumpy said, understanding that his time was almost finished. Maybe not with bullets, because that would be too obvious after Malcolm and Martin. Maybe with heart attacks that can't be investigated, or accidents that can't be prevented, or simply the natural exhaustion that comes from fighting impossible odds for too many years. "What do you want us to do?" asked his oldest associate, a man who'd been with Bumpy since the 1930s, and understood better than anyone how to preserve dangerous truths until they could be safely revealed. "I want you to remember," Bumpy said, "I want you to keep Malcolm's message alive until people are ready to hear it without being destroyed by it. And I want you to understand that what's happening to black leadership isn't accidental, isn't natural, and isn't the inevitable result of personality conflicts or ideological differences. It's systematic, planned, and brilliantly executed by people who've learned that the most effective way to control a liberation movement is to fund it, direct it, and eliminate anyone who threatens to take it in directions that might actually liberate somebody." July 7th, 1968. Bumpy Johnson collapsed at Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue, the same establishment where he'd conducted business with politicians, legitimate businessmen, and community leaders for 2 decades. He died of apparent heart failure at age 62, officially from natural causes, though people who'd known him understood that natural causes could include 40 years of government pressure, systematic harassment, and the psychological toll of watching his community's most courageous leaders systematically eliminated. But Bumpy's death didn't silence Malcolm's warning. The men Bumpy had trusted with those 7 dangerous words preserved them carefully, sharing them only with people they trusted completely, passing them down through generations of Harlem residents who understood that their neighborhood's history was more complex and more threatening than official accounts suggested. The 7 words today. For decades, Malcolm X's final warning remained buried in Harlem's oral tradition, shared among people who'd witnessed the systematic transformation of black leadership, who'd understood the connections between foundation funding and movement control, who'd recognized the pattern of elimination that had reshaped civil rights from liberation struggle into managed reform. As government documents were declassified and foundation archives became available to researchers, Malcolm's 7 words proved prophetic beyond anything he could have imagined in 1965. Academic studies documented the extensive financial relationships between major foundations and civil rights organizations. Investigative journalism revealed the systematic ways that corporate interests had shaped civil rights agendas through strategic funding and withdrawal of support. But most Americans continued believing the official narratives of Malcolm X's assassination, Martin Luther King's murder, and Fred Hampton's death. They accepted explanations that portrayed these killings as isolated incidents motivated by personal grievances, religious conflicts, or random violence rather than coordinated elements, in a broader strategy to eliminate independent black leadership. Malcolm's warning, "The movement has been sold to the government," remains relevant today because the strategies he identified continue operating in modified forms. Social movements are still shaped by foundation funding that comes with explicit and implicit conditions limiting their scope and effectiveness. Leaders who focus on manageable reforms receive support and media attention, while leaders who advocate fundamental change are marginalized, discredited, or worse. The controlled opposition strategy Malcolm discovered in 1965 has been refined and perfected over subsequent decades, applied not only to civil rights, but to environmental activism, labor organizing, anti-war movements, and every other form of social change that might threaten established power structures. Malcolm X's final message, delivered to Bumpy Johnson on a cold February night 59 years ago, wasn't just about the 1960s civil rights movement. It was about how power protects itself by controlling its opposition, by funding and directing its critics, by ensuring that even movements for change ultimately serve the interests of those they're supposedly challenging. Remember the 7 words, "The movement has been sold to the government." Remember Bumpy's promise to preserve that warning until people were ready to hear it. Remember that the most dangerous truths are often hidden in plain sight, disguised as help, packaged as support, delivered by people who claim to share your goals while ensuring you never achieve them. Because sometimes the greatest threat to liberation isn't opposition. Sometimes it's controlled opposition. Sometimes it's allies who want to help you win just enough to prevent you from winning everything. Malcolm X understood that fundamental truth. Bumpy Johnson remembered it faithfully. Both men died keeping that secret safe. Until now.